Good afternoon. I work in the global research and analysis team at Kaspersky Lab. So we're the team specifically that is focused on targeted, focused attacks rather than the bulk of malware that comes through the door that needs analysis. So we're not, as a team, working on feeding our products with everything that comes through the door. We're looking at the relationships of different modules, clustering information, looking through all of our statistics, all of the feeds we get from our endpoints and so on, and basically then doing analysis on particular campaigns. It includes WannaCry. It includes things like Project Sauron, Equation, Dooku, Stuxnet, Dark Hotel, and a bunch of others. So what I want to do is just offer a glimpse into the world of targeted attacks and look particularly at some of the trends, some of the developments that we're seeing in that area. So if I start by talking about scale, I've worked in the industry quite a long time, and if we go back to 1994 and you'd gone to Virus Bulletin or you'd gone to some other industry conference and you'd said, well, I've come from the future and we're going to get to a point where we're dealing with 1 million objects into our lab every day, people would have just looked aghast at you. They would not have believed it, because I can remember a time then when people were saying, well, what do we do when we get to 5,000 viruses and we have a glut? So things change. Technology changes. The way we use it changes. But right now, we've got huge numbers coming in. Now, there are about 4,000 people at Kaspersky Lab. So even if we were all malware analysts, we couldn't look at this and analyze every single or reverse engineer every single piece of code manually. So 99.9% of this stuff is automatically analyzed. So a lot of the technologies, a lot of the processes we've built, which maybe in their origins would have been manual, are now designed to operate within a black box effectively. So that allows people like us to focus on some of the more sophisticated attacks. So it's a big problem numerically. If we categorize the threat landscape like this as a pyramid, then the bulk of attacks today remain random speculative attacks that are aimed at anybody. The people don't know who we are, they don't care who we are, they're just looking to make money from bank accounts, they're looking to extort money, they're looking to gather data that they can then sell on, and it's all valuable to them, and they don't really care who I am. What they want is my online identity. They're not interested in me as a person. The 10% at the top, that's the targeted attack where people are going after one organization, or they're going after a particular vertical within the marketplace, or multiple verticals within the marketplace. And then right at the top, we've got where governments get involved. If we look chronologically at malware, and you look at the PC threat particularly, you go back to 1986, and we had boot sector viruses, and then we had macro viruses, and we had worms, and then we had malware for profit, and so on and so forth. And then it's like, well, and then we had governments getting involved. But actually, if you look, that chronology is not right. That's kind of the order in which things were dealt with. It's not necessarily the order in which it happened. Because when we look at Equation or we look at Project Sauron, we see modules that go back to the beginning of this century. And so it's pretty clear that governments were getting involved in developing code way before people realized they were at a serious level. One thing I would say, and it's kind of maybe fairly obvious at this point, coming off the back of the whole WannaCry weekend, is that these look like fixed categories, but they're not actually. There's a trickle down. So we consider the exploit, the Eternal Blue exploit, integrated into WannaCry, and that came from shadow brokers. Allegedly, that's an NSA-developed exploit, and you think, well, actually, we've got criminal activity here, extortion, effectively, but it's on the back of something that's developed further up that food chain, if you like. So you can't de-invent things. And even at a conceptual level, when people in the top part of that, the top 10% of that, are developing something, even at a conceptual level, it gives ideas to other people. If you remember a few weeks ago, the Vault 7 release, and I can remember talking to one of my colleagues about it and sort of musing on the fact of whether it would help people in the security industry, really, and we both agreed it wouldn't. But what it probably will do is give OPSEC ideas to criminal activity or people involved in criminal activity who wouldn't have thought of trying to cover their tracks in this or that way. But they do now, because that information is out there. So that there is kind of fuzzy line here. And if we focus just particularly on this, this is a list of the stuff that we've been involved in analysing going back to 2010 and Stuxnet. And you can see that it's sort of got bigger, but that almost certainly, I think, isn't because we see more targeted attacks. It's that people in the industry have got better at analysing it. We're more aware of it as a problem, for one thing, and we've got better at analysing it. There is here government-sponsored activity. There's also criminal activity. So, you know, we include Satellite Turler, for example. We include Dark Hotel, the Desert Falcons or Carbonac. So, you know, what we have seen over the last 5, 7, 8 years is this definite focus on particular entities or on groups of entities and trying to get information out of them. But of course, most of this involves espionage, getting information, in other words. It doesn't have to. So you think back to Shamoon and the impact that had on Saudi Aramco, where it was wholesale erasure of data. And in a weird sort of way, we're back to where PC malware started, which was doing things like erasing data, corrupting data, but actually for different purposes and on a much, much bigger scale than just being disruption. And don't get me wrong, you know, what happened in 1990, 1995, you can call it vandalism, but actually it has a big impact on an organization. But it doesn't have the concerted impact that something like Shamoon or even, you know, the wiper used against Sony Pictures in 2014 had. So, you know, messing with data is one thing, but of course damaging physical processes is another, because we live in a world where we are so connected now and so many things are controlled by computer that we offer a much, much bigger attack surface than we ever have before. So that means that sabotage of physical processes is definitely on the agenda. You think about the Ukrainian power issue at the end of last year and at the end of the year before that, actually. You think about a blast furnace in Germany being taken offline, and you think of other attacks, and you know, we are in an age where substantial impact on citizens can be had by criminal groups or others. So this is the sort of area that we work in, and I mean, for anyone that's interested, we publish a lot of information on our website. We have several websites. We've got Kaspersky.com, which is what you would expect, the standard corporate information. We have SecureList.com, which is where our group tends to hang out and post its information. So if you're looking for analysis of WannaCry, you're looking for an FAQ, you're looking for connections between WannaCry and Lazarus, to pick something very topical, then SecureList.com will be the place to go. We don't publish everything there because the poor guys in our content team would be non-stop if we did that. But we have a portal which is specifically geared towards delivering APT threat information, and that's on a subscription basis. So we've got masses of information on that. And if you want to find out the kind of flavor of what that is, SecureList.com will give you that. You know, whether that is stuff that we think has nation-state involvement or whether it's things like WannaCry. And on that whole issue, I mean, it's worth mentioning, you know, I say we think has nation-state involvement. We look at code. That's what we do for a living. So what we have access to is what's coded, not to human intelligence, not to signals intelligence. So when we look at, people say to us, well, can you attribute this or attribute that? And the answer is no. We're not necessarily saying, well, nobody can. What we're saying is that from our vantage point, we can't really get into that attribution thing because we don't have access to all of the bits. What we do see is the code, and we can look at the relationships between that. So when we look at WannaCry and we say, well, we think here there are some points of similarity or some code reusage between that and Lazarus, then that's what it's based on. We're not talking about attribution there, we're talking about clustering of information. And it's based on code which isn't in the WannaCry that we've just dealt with, but it was in one of the sort of proto versions of WannaCry, and then didn't make it into the later ones. If it's a false flag operation, and we do see plenty of those, you would expect it to be in the one that hit the streets, so to speak. But there are other points of similarity as well. So it seems a bit odd, because Lazarus as a group is very focused, targeted attack campaigns, and this isn't. It's random. Is it financially motivated? You might think not. I mean, estimates between $50,000 and $80,000 as the net profit from this. You think, well, that's not, they can't retire on that, let's be honest. But we don't know is the simple point. But at the moment, what we're saying is we think there's that comparison, but it needs further investigation, and we'll be doing that. We've invited other researchers to do the same, and information will come out. And, if we go back to Stuxnet, Dooku, Gauss, and Flame, it was actually a case that more information was revealed of the connections between those as time went by. So that's the area we work in. What about some of the trends? Well, one of the things we've seen more is the sort of customization or tailoring of code per attack. And the ultimate expression of this really, or the example at the furthest edge, was Project Sauron, where every single attack was using a customized implant, so per victim. So that's at the extreme end, but it's not just Project Sauron. So we're seeing that as a trend, greater customization. The benefit of that, of course, for the attackers is that there's less commonality, and therefore things like IOCs become less valuable across different attacks.
David, on that one, how many original weapon writers do you think there are, individuals or groups, as opposed to those who take one and develop a derivative? Because there are those two different.
Yeah, there are, for sure.
And can we go after the originators harder than we are at the moment?
Okay, let's take the first question of that. I don't have an answer. I mean, you're right. There are definitely people who are creating code from scratch. And if you're talking about the level of sophistication of Project Sauron or Dooku, not many, actually. Not many. And numerically, going back to my pyramid, numerically, they'll never occupy very much of that pyramid, I don't think. But in terms of the impact they have, then obviously that can be huge. And again, there is a trickle down, so people do get to reuse. And it works the other way too. We see targeted attack campaigns where they pick off-the-shelf stuff, again, in order to maybe throw people off the scent. And, it's like, well, it can't be one of these guys at the top because they're using just a Chinese off-the-shelf exploit kit available anywhere. I mean, there are certain things we can do. I mean, everybody obviously is looking to see what happens with these wallets, for example, with WannaCry. And if there's any movement there, then there's an opportunity to kind of jump on that. If it's not for profit and there's nobody looking to cash out, it gets harder.
I suppose, sorry, what I'm thinking here, in the physical world, bomb makers have signature styles that they build bombs.
Yep.
I don't just mean fingerprints, I mean the way they craft it.
Yeah, yeah.
The same is true.
It definitely is. Yeah, it definitely is.
Down to tracing that back to an individual from when they were a team, because they started to develop a trade craft. I know Kaspersky Lab has done some of that attribution piece.
Mm.
Is that still being shared as much on AVN as it used to be?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. And you're right. I mean, there are characteristics. I mean, I've mentioned, WannaCry and Lazarus because they're topical. But I mean, to take that as an example, one of the sort of features of the Lazarus group is that actually they seem to implement the same functionality in different ways. So they clearly within the group they're getting people to do different implementations. That's kind of interesting because, as a programmer, I suppose your automatic thing is, if I can reuse that, I'm going to reuse it because why, nobody wants to reinvent the wheel if they can help it. But, there can be a purpose for doing that. Sometimes it helps us more, I suppose, in terms of giving broad, I don't want to say attribution, but connections between things. So, this looks like Lazarus, because you look at the characteristics. But that doesn't necessarily get us any closer to who that is. But certainly that sort of bespoke thing is happening. And the flip side, and it's happened for a lot longer, is people using common off-the-shelf malware as a way of setting false flags. The ephemeral malware is, again, a growing trend of just in memory. So we think about APT, Advanced Persistent Threat, and the thing is it's complex code, and you get in there and you bury yourself in the network, and you stay there as long as you can, and you pull information off the system. The danger there is that you have a point of presence for a long enough time, there's a risk that you will be detected. So what some of the attackers are doing is just saying, well, you know what, we'll use things like PowerShell as a way of infiltrating the network, and we will inject some code into a process in memory and just sit in memory. And sure, somebody comes along and powers it off, gone. But actually what we gain in terms of stealth is worth it to lose maybe the advanced part of that or the persistent part of that anyway. Misdirection and manipulation. I mean, one of the things at the end of last year when we were looking forward is to say, well, we see false flag operations. We see people laying false trails. It could be language. It could be other artifacts. It could be the use of off-the-shelf exploits. But things which are designed to throw people off the scent, people like us. What we haven't seen is A attacks B and makes it look like C did it. But we think that is almost certainly going to happen. It may have happened, because we don't really know. If somebody is doing that effectively, the finger of suspicion goes on A when actually it's party C who's doing it. And so we're in a situation where that kind of interplay between international politics, computer malware, actually that potential exists. And unlike a physical attack, and I guess this goes back to the issue earlier, there are less ways of pointing it back to somebody than there would be. I mean, the guys that did the Hatton Garden job, there's much more of a chance of catching those guys than the people behind Carbonac, unless they make a mistake. And we look for mistakes, and law enforcement agencies look for mistakes. And in the case of the No More Ransom project, law enforcement security companies pool resources as a way of trying to work around encryption, as an example. So that misdirection and manipulation is only going to grow. It's not going to get any less. We've mentioned critical infrastructure. And it's always tricky when you stand up here and you sort of talk about this, because the last thing you want to do is actually big things up to the point where you're talking about Die Hard 4 and you scare people, and nobody wants to do that. Now, I watched a documentary, I don't know if anybody saw it, I think it was Channel 4 a couple of years ago, where it's like Die Hard 4, myth or reality. And researchers from different fields looking at this, the general consensus at the end was any one of those things, yeah, it could be done. All of them happening at once, that's probably not going to happen. But, Die Hard was sort of pointing towards a situation which is real, where we can be touched in so many more ways. Bricking the Internet of Things. I mean, we saw Mireille last year, where people were, effectively hijacking DVRs and routers and other connected objects as a way of launching a distributed denial of service attack on providers on the internet, DNS providers, for example. One of the things that we're sort of beginning to see now, and we thought this was coming too, would be maybe people out there saying, you know what, security is woeful on some of these devices, and we're going to highlight that fact. So we're going to take control of them, and we're going to brick them. Or, you know, we're going to just make it very clear that it's insecure. And I'm trying to think of the name of the recent one that we did a report on. Hijami, or I can't remember. But is doing that because we can't see any other purpose for which it's used. So that we think that one's happened. There's always been an underlying economy beneath cybercrime, or at least there has since 2003-04. It's not for kicks, it's for money. So, you know, when I say that we're seeing malware as a service, I'm talking about a development of a trend that's been there for a long time. If you think about ransomware as an example, it takes a certain know-how to implement encryption and to do it in a way which doesn't make it easy for people like us to get round it and decrypt data. But there are lots more people out there getting involved in criminal activity who don't have that know-how. So one of the things we see is that the groups who are capable of developing sophisticated attacks will make additional money by effectively leasing out that know-how. So they provide marketplaces where people can come along and sort of become affiliates. And they will distribute malware that they didn't necessarily create, but they've got their registration key in there and they get a kickback for every infection. The same is happening with financial attacks, and it's happening also with ransomware. And then finally, you know, this whole thing of targeting and tracking, again at the beginning of the year when we did our look forward, we normally do a retrospective and a look forward. And the look forward was just a reflection on the fact that the Googles and the Twitters and the Facebooks of this world sit on masses of personal data, absolutely masses of it. And, you know, that's valuable information for various parties out there. It could be governments, it could be criminal groups, you know, low-level criminal groups or organized criminal groups, but actually that massive information could be so valuable that at some point somebody is going to try and tap into that. Obviously the human factor remains. It always does. You know, however sophisticated, from Stuxnet down to, you know, some routine banking Trojan, it involves somebody doing something that jeopardizes their security or the company they work for. And, you know, you take, for example, Carbonac, which was a targeted attack. Starting point is to get somebody in the bank to install code. And once they've done that, you effectively become an insider. So these guys were recording what people were doing with webcams, using keyloggers and so on, and then they were masquerading as those insiders, either to do bank transfers internationally, to money mule accounts, or indeed to cash out at ATMs with members of the gang on the ground. So the human factor remains huge, and you know, we need to find imaginative ways to patch our human resources, and it's not straightforward and it's not a quick fix, obviously. I'm not going to spend much time on that because you guys do this as meat and drink, and it tends to be kind of for perhaps a small business audience. But actually, what's interesting about this, I think, is that, and I stress with people like that, is the dangers of just looking at the technology. And there is that trend, and you know, we all get involved in it, which is when people are looking at technology, you know, they want to see certain features. And you've got to demonstrate that you've got those features, when actually at the end of the day, they may not be appropriate for every organization. And it's really a question of coming back to the strategy and saying, well, actually, you know, what have we got? Who might want it? How might they get it? How might we stop them? And what's actually appropriate for us as an organization? And the security culture, and it'll be my final point, is, you know, we talk about training and education, but actually it's much more of a cultural thing. And the group I was in earlier when we were talking about the General Data Protection Regulation was actually, it's got to be as much about changing the culture, because everybody actually is a data manager in the organization, every individual member of staff. And if we crack that, then we make ourselves more resilient, whether it's data protection or whether it's security. So thank you for that.